On a hip bone from a Roman grave in the north of England, there's a single deep puncture. Not a sword cut, not a spear, a hole, punched clean through the bone by something with a jaw. The man it belonged to was in his late 20s or early 30s when he died, roughly 1,800 years ago. The wound never healed, which means whatever made it was one of the last things that ever happened to him. For a long time, nobody could say what bit him. When they finally worked it out, the answer settled a much bigger argument about who all the men in that cemetery had been. The grave sits just outside the old Roman city of York, which the Romans called Eboracum. In 2004, a construction project along the road out of the city cut into a cemetery, and what came out of the ground was strange enough that people have argued about it ever since. By the time the digging was done, there were around 82 skeletons. Almost all of them were men, almost all of them were young, and most of them were unusually well built, with the kind of heavy, reworked bone that only comes from years of hard physical training. A lot of them carried old injuries that had healed over, the record of a body that got hurt, recovered, and went back to whatever was hurting it. That part on its own could describe soldiers. Then there's the other thing. A large number of these men had been beheaded, and in grave after grave, the skull had been taken off and set down by the feet or tucked into the arms. That's not how you bury soldiers. So for years, the site had a working label, whispered rather than proven. A cemetery for arena fighters, gladiators. The problem was that nobody could prove it from the bones. Heavy muscle, healed wounds, missing heads. It fit gladiators, but it fit other hard lives too. The label sat there, unconfirmed, for over a decade. Now let's talk about one man in particular, because he's the reason the argument finally moved. In the records, he's just a code, but the bones say a lot about the life attached to it. He was somewhere between 26 and 35, strong like the others, and his skeleton is a list of things that had gone wrong and been survived. As a child, he'd been malnourished, badly enough to leave a mark in the bone, and he'd recovered from it. His spine showed the kind of damage that comes from loading the back too heavily, over and over. There was inflammation in a lung and in a thigh. None of it killed him. All of it was the wear of a body being used hard for a long time. When they buried him, they didn't bury him alone. He went into a single grave with 2 other people. And then, over the top of all 3, someone laid down the bones of a horse. Nobody knows why the horse is there. It could be an offering. It could be grave goods for a fighter, the kind of send-off some of the others at the site were given. It could be something the evidence just can't reach. What matters is that this was not a body thrown in a ditch. Somebody arranged this. And on that arranged, cared-for skeleton, there was a wound that didn't belong to any weapon in the Roman army. The wound was on the pelvis, near the top of the hip, puncture marks on the bone itself. The question was simple to ask and very hard to answer. What has a mouth big enough and strong enough to do that to a hip bone? One quick thing before the answer. This channel works from the actual excavation reports on cases like this, not from whatever's trending, and there's a fresh one every week. Subscribe and the next one turns up for you instead of getting buried. So, what made the mark? You can't just look at a hole in a bone and name the animal. Teeth from different big animals leave different shapes at different spacings with different damage around the edge. To read it, you need something real to compare it against. So the team built a comparison. They took 3-dimensional scans of the marks on the hip. Then they took bite samples from large cats, including a lion at a zoo, and scanned those too. Same method, same detail, laid side by side. They were looking for a match in the shape and spacing of the punctures, not a guess, a fit. The marks on the man's hip fit the jaws of a large cat. The closest match was a lion. And that single result did something no amount of muscle or missing heads had managed to do. It turned the whole cemetery from a maybe into a yes, because a soldier doesn't get bitten by a lion. A slave doesn't get bitten by a lion. There's really only one setting where a man in Roman Britain ends up with a lion's tooth through his hip, and it isn't a battlefield. Here's where the story wants to run ahead of the evidence, and it's worth slowing down for. It's tempting to picture the moment cleanly. Man in the arena, lion, one fatal bite to end it. The bones don't actually say that. The bite marks are perimortem. That means they happened right around the time of death, give or take. What the marks can't tell you is which side of death they fall on, because the difference between a wound made minutes before dying and one made minutes after can be almost invisible in bone. And the location is the catch. The punctures are on the hip, not the throat, not the chest. A hip bite is not usually how a big cat kills. It's often how a big cat moves something. When a lion has brought down prey, it'll clamp on and drag the body somewhere quieter to feed. So there are two readings sitting on the same wound. In one, the lion is what killed him, and the hip is where it caught him. In the other, something else in the arena killed him first, and the lion bit down on the hip afterwards to haul the body off. The researchers were careful about this. Their own phrasing is that the actual cause of death left no trace on the skeleton, which isn't strange in itself, since plenty of killing wounds never touch bone. What they can say for certain is that a lion's teeth closed on this man's hip at or very near the end of his life. Whether that bite was the ending or the clearing away after the ending, the skeleton won't say. That question is open, and it stays open. There's one more injury on this skeleton, and it's the one that connects him back to everybody else in that cemetery. At some point, his head was removed. The decapitation happened after he was already dead. It wasn't the killing blow. And he's far from alone in this. Across Driftfield Terrace, taking the head off after death shows up again and again, common enough that it looks less like an accident and more like a practice. The trouble is that a practice can mean very different things. One reading is mercy, a man torn open by a lion, past saving, put out of his suffering with a clean cut. Another reading has nothing to do with the arena at all. Decapitation after death turns up at other Roman period burials in Britain too, as some kind of funeral custom whose logic hasn't survived with it. Both readings fit this grave. The mercy version and the ritual version leave the same mark on the same neck, and the bone can't choose between them. So the picture we're left with is a man who was malnourished as a child and lived through it, trained his body into something powerful, was bitten by a lion at the end, and then had his head removed and placed carefully in the ground beside two others, under a horse. Almost every step of that is certain. The reasons behind the last two steps are not. That leaves the last question, and it's the one that stretches past this single grave. What kind of fighter goes into an arena against a lion, and how did a lion get to the north of Roman Britain to meet him? The role has a name, a bestiarius, not the fighter of the paintings trading sword blows with another man, but the one sent in against animals, sometimes a trained volunteer, sometimes a condemned prisoner, sometimes a slave with no say in it. Given this man's hard-used body and the manner of his death, that's the role the researchers place him in. And that reframes the whole site. For years, the safe assumption was that arena spectacle on this scale belonged to Rome itself, to the great amphitheater at the center of the empire. This grave sits about as far from that center as the empire reached. York in this period was not a backwater. Senior Roman commanders and politicians were stationed there. One of them, Constantine, was declared emperor in the city. Powerful men expected the entertainments they were used to, and that appetite traveled with them all the way to the northern edge. So a lion, an animal that lives nowhere near Britain, was captured, moved across the empire, and kept alive long enough to be released into an arena in York against a man whose bones we can now read. The amphitheater it happened in hasn't even been found yet. For 1800 years, the beast hunts of the Roman world were something we knew only from mosaics and written accounts. Pictures of the spectacle and words about it, but never the body of anyone who'd actually been in it. One puncture in one hip changed that. It's the first physical proof that a person fought a big cat in the Roman arena, and it turned up at the far edge of the map, in a grave that had been waiting to be understood since 2004. A single deep puncture in a single hip bone, in a grave of headless men at the edge of the empire. It couldn't tell us his name, or whether the lion was what killed him, or why they took his head. It could tell us one thing for certain: he was there.